Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's book talk, part of an ongoing virtual series from the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library that connects writers, historians, and TR scholars with all of you joining us from near and far, whether you're a lifelong TED head or someone just swinging by to learn something new. My name is Marcy Whale, and I'm the Manager of Public Programs and Education here at the TRPL. And tonight, I am delighted to be joined by Chris Epting, who will be discussing his text, Theodore Roosevelt in California, the Presidential Adventure That Saved the Wilderness. So as I introduce our guest here, just take a minute and start warming up the chat by telling us where you're tuning in from tonight. We always like to see whether it's everybody in Medora or all the way out in Maine, so feel free to just drop in the chat, and then we'll circle back to those after the biography. So a little bit about Chris Epting here. He is a prolific author of more than 50 books, many of which are bestsellers focused on American history. With a passion for exploring the past, Chris loves tracing history's footsteps and learning by visiting the actual locations where historic events unfolded. He has hosted several television programs related to history, including Orange County History Hunters on PBS and It Happened Here on the Reels Network. In his latest book, Theodore Roosevelt in California, the Presidential Adventure That Saved the Wilderness, Epting examines Roosevelt's famous 1903 Great Loop Tour. This remarkable 9-week journey marked Roosevelt's first visit to California, featured a legendary camping trip with John Muir, and showcased his dedication to conservation and the wilderness. And in addition to being a prolific author, a fantastic storyteller, and someone who I always love talking to, Chris is also a very generous man who has offered to give away 3 copies of tonight's featured selection. So to be entered in a chance to win one of Chris's freshly printed books, please fill out the following form in the chat, and winners will be contacted after the event. So take a minute to fill that out. And before I turn the mic over to Chris, I'd like to remind everyone to please feel free to drop questions in the chat during Chris's talk. We'll circle back to them in our Q&A. And Chris, we've got people from California, Minnesota, Indiana, North Dakota. So we've got a wonderful American representation here. And with that, I will turn the floor over to you. I'm excited to learn.
Marcy, thank you so much. I've enjoyed getting to know you through this process and super excited and honored to be here as part of your project, what's happening out in North Dakota. And I cannot wait to visit, as I'm sure everybody here online is thinking as well. Thank you for the opportunity. I have a brand new book out about a topic that has fascinated me for a long, long time, for years, Theodore Roosevelt's Great Loop Tour in 1903, which I'm sure some people here may be somewhat familiar with, but this is a fairly deep dive. And I'm going to start off by setting the table a little bit about the world was like in 1903. I think we tend to forget sometimes just how different the country was when Roosevelt was in power, and what it meant, and what culture was like surrounding him. For instance, 1903 is the year the crayon was first commercially introduced. I know it's hard to imagine a world without crayons, but it was so. 1903 was the year of the very first World Series. I'm a big baseball history fan, and so this is meaningful to me, and I'm sure many others. But again, there was no World Series prior to 1903. 1903, of course, is the year the Wright brothers flew at Kitty Hawk, thus ushering in a new technological age. And 1903 is also the year that the teddy bear is first commercially introduced. And again, I'm sure some of you are familiar with what happened the year before when TR was hunting down in Mississippi, and the governor of Mississippi was aghast that Roosevelt was sort of the one in the party that did not bag a bear. And so he infamously ties, the governor that is, ties a sick bear to a tree and then implores Roosevelt to fire away. Roosevelt, of course, doesn't do so. He liberates the bear. A cartoonist famously captures this moment. This becomes a very compelling topic around the country, to a point where a man in Brooklyn decides to, with he and his wife, they develop what was called Teddy's Bear, which comes out in 1903. And so again, 1903, there's a lot happening. Roosevelt is president. Let's step back a couple of years of why Roosevelt is president. It's after this gentleman, William McKinley, is assassinated tragically in Buffalo in 1901, and thus sets the table, of course, for America's youngest president. And Roosevelt in 1902, he's obviously a compelling figure. He's never been out west though. And so in 1902, his second year into office, he begins thinking about, okay, what's going to bring me to the West Coast? How can I get out there? He's formulating the trip, but in 1902 something happens that really thwarts any idea of a West Coast trip that year. He's in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, going to give a speech, and it's there where his horse-drawn carriage is hit with a trolley car. Now, one other backstep here as well. After McKinley's assassination, that essentially gives rise to what we know today as the modern day Secret Service. Originally, the Secret Service was formed more to thwart counterfeiting than anything else, but after the assassination, they become focused on presidential safety. And on this day, when this terrible accident occurs in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, September 3rd, 1902, Roosevelt, as I say here in the book, and several other prominent politicians came within inches of being killed. Secret Service agent William Craig was fatally injured, becoming the first Secret Service agent killed in the line of duty. So this is, again, a very impactful moment. Again, you mentioned earlier, I like geographic history, the location of exact sites. If you go to Pittsfield today, there is a marker exactly where that impact took place. And Roosevelt now is in the hospital. And this sets up something that gets us to the 1903 trip in part. Roosevelt is a voracious reader, of course, and he reads at least one book by a gentleman named John Muir, the famed Scottish naturalist who moved to the United States as a young man and traversed his way across the country, eventually winding up in the high sea areas, settling in and discovering Yosemite in many ways that nobody discovered before. The book was called Our National Parks, and while there was no official national park system yet, the title is really kind of colloquial, just Muir imagining a nation full of parks. Roosevelt is quite taken with the words within. And so as he begins formulating the trip out west, he decides that he also wants this trip out west to include a visit with John Muir. John Muir, of course, one of the most quotable, along with Roosevelt, one of the most quotable people of their era. God never made an ugly landscape, he said. All that the sun shines on is beautiful, so long that it is wild, as it is wild. So that is John Muir. This is a rough approximation of what the Great Loop Tour was going to look like. A logistical nightmare of sorts. It was going to be 9 weeks away from the White House. That alone, I think, distinguishes this as a presidential adventure unlike any other before, since, or that we'll probably ever see, at least in any of our lifetimes. The idea of being away from the White House for 9 weeks, traveling upwards 14,000 miles in total, I think cutting across 26 states or so, doubling back depending on schedule, really kind of a crazy planned trip, but nevertheless a trip that does get planned. And part of this, as I said, Roosevelt, he's going to see many things for the first time. He's going to see Yellowstone for the first time. He's going to see the Grand Canyon for the first time. He also wants to see Yosemite for the first time. So what he does is reaches out to John Muir, and he writes this letter in March of 1903. Interestingly, it's on White House stationery. I believe it was just the year before, in '02, that Roosevelt was responsible for officially naming the White House from the executive mansion. So on White House stationery, the letter reads in part to Mr. Muir, I do not want anyone with me but you as to take me through the Yosemite. I want to be just in the open with you. He's expressing very emotionally this idea to not just visit with John Muir, but to disappear into the wilderness. He already has a camping trip set up midway on this trip with John Burroughs. But that's going to be much more kind of programmed and organized. Everyone's going to know where he is. What he's proposing to Muir is essentially disappearing into the wild without staff, without Secret Service, a very big deal. And what I'm going to go to next really distinguishes, I think, the difference between these two men. Here you've got Roosevelt's letter, very proper and prepared on White House stationery. And then in return, he gets this response from John Muir, apparently written in either ancient pen or pencil. And originally, Muir was not going to be available to meet with Roosevelt. He was going to be in Europe, as he states in this letter, where you can see the erase marks there, where he says, a few small changes have brought this trip into harmony. One of the changes was a journalist friend saying to Muir, You do not want to miss an opportunity to go camping with the president. Think of what he could do to help you. At this point, Muir was becoming concerned about the encroachment of logging, of tourism, of other things that he felt were going to take their toll on the great outdoors. So Muir rethinks his European trip, cancels it, and thus the game is on. These guys are going to have their own secret private camping trip, 3 nights in Yosemite. And so in early April, Roosevelt hits the road in this train. The last car is called the Elysian. That is the presidential car, decked out with beautiful teak and mahogany furniture and plush velvet. I mean, really just a statesman-like presidential car that Roosevelt will be living in essentially for the next 9 weeks. And as he goes around the country, again, going back to this idea of how different the world was then. This is an era before amplification. There were no public address systems or electric microphones. So Roosevelt, who is given, they say on average, between 6 to 8 speeches per day on this trip, is out in the open, as you can see here in one of the images, giving his speeches without any sort of electronic help. And I think this also speaks to the idea that back then, being a politician, a successful politician, involved a physicality that was unique. You had to have not just great oratory skills, but the ability to project those things far and beyond. Roosevelt would do plenty of little whistle stops like this around the country. He would also give big speeches. He gave the commencement to Berkeley on this trip in front of 10,000 people. So wherever he went, he was met with groups of people. He would have some prepared notes, some speeches were given off the cuff. But the idea, again, just the exhaustive nature. He's running the country from the train. Now, luckily, I want to point out, too, it's a fairly quiet time in our nation. Congress is, for the most part, in recess. Nothing really happens on the world stage. It requires too much from Roosevelt on this trip. So it's really one of the only perfect pockets of 9 weeks. He could have done this at any point where he could be away from his family, away from the White House, still conduct business and get close to the people. I want to point out, too, this wasn't essentially a political trip. It wasn't an election year. Roosevelt is traveling through states that he's pretty much sure he's got shored up for the next election. This was a chance for him to see the country, to meet people, and really just enjoy himself in the outdoors and explore. And I think he was getting a little stir crazy, maybe a little itchy for a trip like this, which puts him on the road. We see him riding up front. By all accounts, he became like a little kid on this trip many times. He would go up, he would pull the whistle. He would really just have the time of his life as he's traveling west. About a month into the trip, the book contains many little anecdotal things that happen before he gets to California. This is one I wanted to talk about now because it's one of the more popular and certainly one of my favorite aspects of the book, one of the stories. He's in a little town called Sharon Springs, Kansas, which is on the distinct western border, kind of butting up against Colorado. In 1903, the population of Sharon Springs was 100. Today, I think it's 800, so it's still a small town. But it also represents that Roosevelt wasn't just going to big cities. On the contrary, it was more about places like Sharon Springs on the Great Loop Tour. He goes to Sharon Springs, he comes out of church, rides horses for a couple of hours, comes back, and a young girl, a 13-year-old girl named Pearl, approaches him, and she has brought a gift, a 2-week-old badger. And this is Roosevelt's staff is thinking, well, you can't take a badger on the train. Roosevelt, though, to the contrary, is completely charmed by the gift. He accepts the badger. Her name was Pearl Gorsuch. And there you can see Roosevelt holding the baby badger, which he names Josiah on the spot. Roosevelt states that he names it in honor of Pearl's brother, Josiah. I did some digging into this, though. I believe it was her father who was named Josiah. I went back and traced the birth records. But either way, there's a member of the Gorsuch family named Josiah. That becomes the badger's name. And from this point on, Josiah becomes a character in this crazy play, living on the train for the next month, ultimately making it back to the White House. And at the end of my chat here, I will tell you what happened to him. And as a thank you to Pearl and her family. Roosevelt takes her on a special tour of the train with her family, gives her a little medal and flowers, and there's a really nice exchange there that is documented by the press. So now with Josiah on board, it's onward, cracking on toward California. Again, I have many images of the book of Roosevelt getting out. Here we see him with cowboys cooking and just having a really grand old time in all of these great little towns across Colorado and on into California, which he arrives on May 7th, 1903, in Redlands, California. He wanted to go there. I believe that was McKinley's first stop in California. And he unveiled a bust as a tribute to McKinley, which you can still see at the local library there. To quote TR, he said that day, "Coming today over the mountain range, coming down here, seeing what you have done makes me realize more and more how much this whole country should lay stress on what can only be done by the wise use of water and therefore the wise use of the forests and the mountains." So he's right away taken with the deserts and the mountains and soon the oceans. He's going to work his way around the state a little bit in Southern California. Wherever he goes, whether it's San Bernardino or Riverside or Pomona, he is greeted like a king homecoming. Buildings are adorned with millions of floral arrangements, tens of thousands of people coming out. Again, he's giving 6 to 8 speeches a day, no microphones, going out there. The thought of it is, again, it's exhausting to read about, yet he has obviously a tremendous amount of energy and he's putting it into good work here. He replants the parent navel orange tree in Riverside, California at the Mission Inn. If you ever go to the Mission Inn today, it's a beautiful hotel, very mission style hotel in Riverside, California. The lounge downstairs is called the Presidential Lounge. And back then it was actually the bedroom where Roosevelt stayed, a number of other presidents over the years as well. And today it's called the Presidential Lounge. So you can step into that space where he actually stayed on this trip. And now you can see this is the first day he sees the Pacific Ocean, which is visible in the background there. This is working up the coast, if you know California, Ventura, close to Santa Barbara, Montecito. That's where the train is wending its way up. And he finally arrives in San Francisco. The book covers some other things when he sees his first grove of redwood trees outside of Santa Cruz. These are wonderful moments of Roosevelt really kind of soaking up the natural energy of California and really enjoying it. But in his mind now, he is just a couple of days away from this secretive camping trip with John Muir. There's a huge parade in San Francisco, which there's some wonderful film footage of that another museum has posted before. Rare footage, a couple of minutes worth, of all the schools closed down and so the school children are all lining the streets and flags waving. Some really marvelous footage from the parade in San Francisco. And then it's going to be time to meet this gentleman the next morning in a little town called Raymond, outside of Yosemite, about 30 miles. Back then it was called the Gateway to Yosemite. Now, gateway is kind of a relative term because when they get there the next day, Roosevelt and Muir will get on that stagecoach and ride about 30 to 35 miles to Yosemite. It's almost 10 hours of travel on this stagecoach here. So you can imagine the kind of bonding time these men had, rocking back and forth for nearly 10 hours with Muir pointing out the various trees and animals and lakes and everything that they saw. And this is where they say Roosevelt was really taken in by Muir's ability to express, to analyze, and really diagnose what's happening in nature. They arrive up at the famed Mariposa Grove, and Roosevelt being a bit of a tourist here. If you go to Yosemite today, that tree is still there, but it's not standing. It's fallen over, but you can still see the tunnel carve out, the notch where they rode through here back then. And then there's a great pose here at a tree called the Grizzly Giant. Now, this is an interesting moment. You can see John Muir just to the right there of Roosevelt, right of center. And within minutes of this picture being taken, everyone but Muir and 2 other men, one to Charles Leidig, who's going to tend to the food, and Archie, who's going to tend to the horses. Everyone else but these 2 guys are dismissed. So it's going to be these 4 men left in the Yosemite wild. And nobody on Roosevelt's staff seems to be particularly happy about this because they're not going to know exactly where the president is for the next 2 nights, which, if you think about it today, is it borders madness and chaos. Back then, as I show in the book, the newspapers loved this. They revered the sense of adventure. They were thrilled that Roosevelt was doing this, and as was Roosevelt, presumably. So I like to, as part of my research, study, and just travel, I like to retrace footsteps and always, as much as you can, find yourself in the presence of where men like this were. So, of course, when you go and stand by that tree today, very little on the tree has changed, thankfully, and you can stand there and just imagine what those words were like at the moment Roosevelt summoned everybody to head down to the Wawana Hotel where they were going to be staying without him. So from now, we kind of jump ahead to night one. The first night of the camping trip supposedly is about 100 yards from this tree, the grizzly giant. And as I wrote here, the president said to Charlie Leidig, "Leidig, please do not let anybody disturb me because I am tired and I want rest and sleep." Charlie did the cooking. He said they had fried chicken and beefsteak for supper that night. The president drank strong black coffee and went to bed early on the first night under the grizzly giant. The only shelter provided for the president was, quote, shelter half, which is kind of a half a tent, under which about 40 blankets were piled to serve as a bed. The president got just as deep into these as he wanted for warmth and comfort. 4 mules were used to haul this equipment. Now, the other part that's interesting, and this is actually taken from a wonderful article written at Yosemite a couple of decades ago, pulled from Charles Leidig's diaries. But the other interesting part here as well is that Muir supposedly camped on a bed comprised of twigs and branches that he created. So again, this is not REI. This is Roosevelt on 40 blankets. This is Muir on twigs and branches. And oh, by the way, it snows overnight, about 6 to 8 inches by all accounts. And so down at the hotel, Roosevelt's staff is really wondering what is going on up there. Is the president safe? He is. Roosevelt and Muir jump on their horses the next day. They race up to Glacier Point. There's a myriad of stories in the book. Muir lights a dead tree on fire and creates beautiful, dramatic pyre that Roosevelt does a dance around. Again, they're bonding in nature. Roosevelt has escaped all of the pressures and noise of politics and meeting people, and he's where he wants to be. He is sleeping the next night under the silver fir trees by Glacier Point. And this is really, when we get back to Charles Leidig's diary, a very critical moment that scholars point to, and here's the reason why. Around the campfire that night, Leidig stated that Roosevelt and Muir talked far into the night regarding Muir's glacial theory of the formation of Yosemite Valley. Leidig stated they talked a great deal about the conservation of forests in general and Yosemite in particular. He heard them, this is the key line, he heard them discussing the setting aside of other areas in the United States for park purposes. It seems strange now that these conversations weren't happening a lot, but again, it's only 1903. There weren't a lot of concerns yet, but a lot of people will point back years later to this conversation, this idea, this concept, this basic notion of putting places aside as the spark of the birth of the National Park Service. So the next morning, Roosevelt wakes up refreshed after this invigorating conversation. He has a photographer who has come up on horseback to shoot 4 images. This is one of them at Washburn Point, just a little ways from Glacier Point where they camped. A beautiful photographic representation of Roosevelt up there at Yosemite. Roosevelt poses again solo, very determined with the Yosemite Falls right behind him. And then he talks Muir into posing with him as well. You can see Muir is not nearly as comfortable in front of the camera. And again, such a distinct differentiation in styles here. You've got Roosevelt outfitted with his cowboy hat and neckerchief and boots. You have Muir dressed more like he's going to church, which is how he viewed nature, as a sanctuary. He wears a shirt and tie, a frock coat, leather shoes. So again, 2 very different men, but they are joined by their love, respect, admiration, and reverie of nature. So after the second night, oh, by the way, of course, getting back to the idea of standing where something happened, we find the rock up there at Glacier Point. You can stand right where those men posed on that May morning in 1903. Next day, they ride back down into the valley, triumphant. Roosevelt staff is exhaling all around. On the third night of the trip, they know where Roosevelt's going to be at Bridal Veil Falls. So they're still not thrilled about it, but at least they know that if he got hurt or something happened, they would know where to go. They would know how to tend to him. But all as well as they come down. And the next morning, they wrap up. They take the stagecoach another 10 hours back to the train. They get on the train. I believe they part at a little town called Merced, and they say goodbye to each other. They won't see each other for a number of years, but they will be in fairly constant touch in recent time as they both begin formulating what's going to happen next in terms of preservation. I love this quote from Muir immediately after the experience. Camping with the president was a memorable experience. I fairly fell in love with him. Again, these words are not to be taken lightly. As different as they were, they did bond over this. And as we know what happened as the years went on. I mean, that year, if you didn't know, Pelican Island was Roosevelt's first real stand in terms of establishing, I think, the first federal wildlife reserve in Florida. But as time rolls on, after the meeting with Muir, after the communication, Roosevelt, of course, becomes the conservationist president. This merely scratches the surface of what he did in terms of preservation, creating 5 new national parks, 51 wildlife sanctuaries. It goes on and on and on. The National Park Service, of course, is formally created in 1916. And in general, it's Muir, Roosevelt, and Stephen Mather who are generally credited with creating the idea, the concept, the necessity for just such a thing. So I've moved through those pieces fairly quickly. The book unpacks the trip in a lot more detail. I did this because I wanted to get to another couple of aspects in the book that I feel are important and much less known than the camping trip with Muir. And one of the aspects involves this picture taken from that famous parade in San Francisco right before the Yosemite trip, where we see Roosevelt flanked by black soldiers. And this always jumped out to me as something unique. It's 1903. It's the first year of the formal Secret Service. How is it that Roosevelt is flanked by black soldiers? And the reason has to do with the Buffalo Soldiers, who you may know fought alongside with Roosevelt in 1898 in Cuba, at San Juan Hill. And when Roosevelt learned that they were stationed in San Francisco at the Presidio, he actually had them come out and act as his sentry, which was a very bold move. The sentry included Colonel Charles Young, one of the most decorated black soldiers in American history, who for me has never really gotten a large part of his due. I think he has been honored in certain ways, but I include a chapter in the book dedicated just to him, his story, and what it was like for him to be riding alongside Roosevelt that day in San Francisco. If you didn't know, the Buffalo Soldiers were the first park rangers, essentially, at Yosemite, patrolling, looking for poachers, building roads. For the first decade of the new century, the 20th century, they were the ones who basically ran the forest. And it's a wonderful story that, again, has a lot of other interesting details that I think you'll enjoy if you have a chance to pick up the book. So again, the Buffalo Soldiers was a story I wanted to encompass. And then I wanted to get into talking about Abraham Lincoln a little bit, because you may know that Roosevelt held Lincoln in deep, deep regard. When he's inaugurated in 1905, the ring that Roosevelt wears actually bears a lock of Lincoln's hair. And he was, of course, a great admirer of him. But you may not be familiar with what Lincoln had to do with Yosemite. A little bit before that, though, on the 1903 trip, Roosevelt makes a couple of stops in homage of Lincoln. He stops in Springfield to lay a wreath at Lincoln's tomb. He also unveils a couple of plaques at Lincoln Douglas debate sites throughout Illinois. And to me, this is interesting. The image here in Illinois harkens back to 1865. You may be familiar with when Lincoln was assassinated that year. His body was taken on a processional to various cities, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, where people could come out and watch the body paraded by horse and carriage and pay their respects. And famously, there's an image there in New York City at Union Square at the Roosevelt Mansion, where if you blow up that picture, there is a young, I believe, 8-year-old Theodore Roosevelt next to his brother looking down on the casket as it's drawn by. So Lincoln and Roosevelt are sort of inextricably linked in this sense, but they're also linked as it pertains to Yosemite. And that has to do with this gentleman right here, whose name is Carleton Watkins. Carleton Watkins was a gentleman who grows up in an upstate town of Oneonta, New York. And after the gold rush happens in 1849, he and many other people go to Northern California to find their fortune. He goes out there with a friend of his. And he gets out there and he's not finding much luck, Carleton Watkins anyway. But his friend is. His friend opens up a store that caters to mining supplies and miners and things like that. Does very well. And the friend helps Carleton Watkins out. Carleton Watkins has developed an interest in photography while he's there, especially shooting nature. He's also discovered Yosemite and he wants to photograph Yosemite. His friend hires him at the store. He makes some money, he does some other things until ultimately he has enough money to purchase camera equipment. And so he goes and becomes essentially the first person to ever photograph Yosemite. This is one of the first pictures ever taken there. After a couple of years, he becomes known as the guy who has photographed Yosemite. A New York City art gallery has an exhibit of his images. While they're showing the pictures, a California senator sees the images. He's from California and is unfamiliar with Yosemite. He brings some of the images to Washington and shows Abraham Lincoln, who by all accounts is so impressed with these images, draws into what's known as the Yosemite Valley Grant Act, the very first time the federal government acted to protect scenic wild areas like this, the very first time. I always wondered what Roosevelt knew while he was camping with Muir at Yosemite about what Lincoln did. This is during the Civil War. He signed that in 1864. Lincoln is the first person to protect Yosemite. I've never seen a quote or comment from Roosevelt acknowledging that. I want to believe he knew about that. But if he didn't, it almost makes for a more interesting mystery. And I want to get back a little bit to why that mattered. Carleton Watkins, there's a whole chapter, again, dedicated in my book to him. He becomes very well known and very renowned as a photographer, but then he loses everything. The San Francisco earthquake wipes out his studio, wipes out almost every image, and he dies alone, broken, and broke in an asylum. And it's a really tragic end, but what he gave us, to me, again, it's so notable, it was worthy of its own chapter. But how did he get the money that he needed to become a photographer? It has to do with the gentleman on the left there. That's the friend that moved out with him from Oneonta. His name was Collis Huntington. And Collis Huntington, after opening that store in Sacramento that did so well, he went on with 3 other men to become what was called the Big Four, the guys that basically created our countries, the Transcontinental Railroad, Southern Pacific, Pacific Electric, everything. Collis Huntington was part of that. On his right is his nephew, Henry Huntington, who he bequeathed a large part of his fortune before he died. And Henry Huntington created Huntington Beach here in Southern California, a number of other places as well. But it's intriguing to me that the railroads that Huntington created were the ones that Roosevelt used in his trip out west. So you've got all these great intersections now with the Buffalo Soldiers, with Lincoln, with Huntington, with Roosevelt. It's again, it's such an epic story, the trip unto itself, and I unpack a lot more in the book, but those are sort of the headlines from the book. But I do want to circle back and get back to what happens to Josiah, because everybody always wants to know about that. Here we see one of Roosevelt's children with Josiah. Josiah makes it back to the White House. And if you didn't know, the Roosevelt White House was as much a zoo as it was a family home. There are rumors that there was a baby bear there, an ocelot, countless dogs, cats, lizards, tortoises, everything at the White House. And now you drop Josiah into that. If you don't know about badgers, they are a fairly hostile, aggressive animal, typically. And while the kids love the hell-raising of Josiah, it gets a little bit out of control. And what I've been able to base on a timeline is that Josiah is there. Roosevelt returns home in June of 1903. I think he's there through about August until he becomes a little bit too incorrigible. So they ship him to New York, to Sagamore at the Roosevelt home, the residency. By September, they don't even want him at Sagamore Hill. So there's this kind of cloak and dagger operation. And in the book, I reveal a couple of letters here between the White House and the New York Zoological Park and Society, the Bronx Zoo, where there's a transfer kind of under cover of night where Josiah is brought by train from Sagamore to Long Island City, ultimately to the Bronx Zoo, where he lives out the rest of his life as sort of a celebrity presidential pet, where the Roosevelts still go and visit. Josiah at the zoo. So that was the fate, not too bad a fate actually, of Josiah. A few other odds and ends here that I like to kind of retrace. At the Trader Joe's in Redlands, California, the first city where Roosevelt gets off and speaks. If you go on there today, they've commemorated Roosevelt's visit the way Trader Joe's does, with kind of a local history mirror, which is nice. Roosevelt planted a number of trees around the country, including this Roosevelt palm in Riverside, which is there today, and you can go see. If you go to Yosemite, that's me standing next to a posted sign where the third night of the camping trip was spent right by Bridal Veil Falls. So that to me is a wonderful commemorative marker. I tried to track down the train, the Elysian train car, Roosevelt's presidential train car on that trip, thinking, where could it have gone? It was such a noted part of Roosevelt train mythology. And I finally, before the book went to press, thankfully there was a gentleman at the Pullman Company, one of the historians there. We got the serial number of the car. We traced it fascinatingly in the late 40s. It was the employee lounge, the actual train car at the Stockton train yard in Northern California. Sadly, though, in 1951, it was scrapped. So the train no longer exists. But I do like to retrace other footsteps. Roosevelt stopped on this tour at the Mission up in Santa Barbara, and recently we were up there, and I finally found that doorway to stand under, and again, just kind of think about what was the day like, what were the conversations like when this great man stood right there. And that's what I have in terms of the book. So with that, Marcy, if you would like to do some questions or something, it would be my pleasure. I want to point out, too, that there's a gentleman named Justin Reiner who wrote a really thoughtful, well-prepared forward for my book. Justin is a great Roosevelt scholar and teacher himself. He and I have been friends over the years, and he also portrays Roosevelt in a really compelling manner. And we did an event together. We have some more events coming up where he's going to appear. So, Justin, if you're out there, thank you so much for the kind words in the book and a really well-written forward.
Yes, Justin, if you're out there, hi, looking forward to seeing you when you're out here. Chris, that was an absolutely wonderful talk, as I knew it would be. I loved hearing about the celebrity badger at the zoo. Josiah, I'm happy that he had a happy ending. I was kind of worried.
It could have gone a lot of ways. I will tell you this now, Marcy, in the process of writing. I wrote a children's book recently, and I had never done that before, and I loved the process. There's a wonderful artist locally that I've been working with, Tony Haas, and she and I are now formulating that story as a children's book. Because there are a lot of other interesting moving parts to Josiah, where Josiah, in a way, to me, just represents the ethos of Roosevelt. The fact that he takes this badger and it rides on a train, it's very emblematic of his attitude. That to tend to a badger for a month on a train, I'm sure he had help, but it was still there, and the idea that he writes so lovingly in his letters to his kids from the train about Josiah. Josiah right away is vaunted to this really elevated status in the Roosevelt family, which I like.
I like that a lot too. So I'm looking forward to learning even more about that. Now we've got a few questions coming in through the chat, and I've also got a bunch of questions of my own. Because as people will have found in this talk, Chris is one of those people that you wish you could talk to every day. Just a great storyteller, a wealth of knowledge. But let's turn it over to the chat. And everybody, if you have questions, if you've got, you want to know the most interesting celebrity Chris Epting has ever met, I don't want to spoil it for people, but I've heard that he's met quite some people. So drop your questions in the chat and we'll circle back to that. So, first question, did you discover any surprising commonalities between TR in this story and the subjects of some of your other books?
That's a great question. I have to say, TR, he's so unique and existed in a way that I don't think anybody could exist today. That said, I've written about a lot of interesting people over the years, and I've written memoirs with people. There's a great Olympic athlete named Shirley Babashoff, who was very focused and very driven and really did things on her own terms. And she, to me, had a lot of those qualities of fierce independence, even when it didn't bode well for what the future might bring. She's somebody that I know is like that. I've written books with a gentleman named Tyrus, who I know loves Theodore Roosevelt, and Tyrus also is his own man and is very much about speaking truth in his own way, despite any blowback that might happen. So yeah, I'm fortunate in that I think I get to to hear stories and help tell stories of people that are courageous, and they believe in themselves, and they've got true courage of their convictions, even if it means things aren't going to go their way.
Do you think you, as a writer, are drawn in particular to those stories, or do you find those undercurrents as you're writing about them?
I like to think I'm drawn to them. I like big, I like epic. As a kid growing up, to me, it was all about Babe Ruth and Mark Twain. These just really incredible figures who everything was measured against, and
Yeah.
it's almost as if they knew as it was happening what their role in culture was, and they crafted it. I think Roosevelt was like that as well. I think he was very conscious of what he meant to people, and I think he thought about that. I think Babe Ruth, again, there are certain personalities over time, especially in that century, as culture was being written in a lot of ways, where I think they were hyper conscious. They could stand outside themselves and sort of craft what they needed to be for people in that moment.
Oh, I love that. I have to shout out Katie here, who is saying hello from Wisconsin, the Badger State. So
Yes.
shout out to Badgers everywhere in the states that love them. Next up, if Roosevelt were alive today, which California landscape do you think he would fight the hardest to protect?
I want to believe Yosemite. I really do, because he discovered a lot in Yosemite. It's funny, he wasn't the first president to visit Yosemite. Rutherford B. Hayes was, I think, in 1880, and Taft would go shortly after. But for Roosevelt, I think something happened in Yosemite for him that really kind of changed his view about nature and the country and the world. So I want to believe that. But, California's got, we're fortunate. We've got some incredible places out here. Some that the big ones like Yosemite, Joshua Tree. I think Joshua Tree would have been high on his note. But I think lesser known places like Pinnacles as well would also have spoken in their solitude, and just in how they really allowed you to escape from the noise. Good question.
Let's go down here. Okay, any stories related to Gifford Pinchot in your book?
Not full-on stories, but there's a reference in there. There are people like that, and Charles Loomis, that definitely help shape and guide, obviously, some of the backstory on these things. That's something I would like to dig in, though, on a separate level at some point. That would definitely be on my short list. That's a great point.
And do you think that TR's reverence and doggedness in working to protect Yosemite would have still occurred if he hadn't had those sort of 3 magical days with Muir?
Well, the thing is, I don't know if he was aware. When they were at Yosemite, it was the one place that was safe. It was protected because of Lincoln, which to me is just so crazy. I think Yosemite almost acts as an emblem for every place. I mean, look, he got to experience he camped outside Yellowstone. He was at the Grand Canyon. He was just beginning, I think, to process. I would love, people ask you sometimes, if you could have been anywhere in history, I would love to have gone through Petrified Forest with Roosevelt. That to me would have been fascinating, for him to go through, primordial landscape like that, to get his take on that. But I think Yosemite, I think it changed him in a number of ways. And it just, clearly he was already developing a mindset of preservation. But I think being there, and I think hearing Muir dictated an urgency that he was not aware of at that time. And they met again, as I outlined in the book. I think it's 1912. Roosevelt comes back out to Pasadena to give a speech, and they get to have dinner one last time, which I think is very nice.
Do we know what they ate?
That's a good question. I don't think I do, but you know what? You and I may have to figure that out. There may be a menu. There are certain menus from the 1903 Great Loop Tour that you can see that, Roosevelt's obviously a carnivore and was enjoying. The thing is, he's eating well every night. Again, the physics of this trip to me are so mind-boggling. Of the hundreds of speeches, the tens of thousands of people he's meeting, the fact that a little town like Sharon Springs, Kansas, can have a visit from the President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, just like San Francisco can. A little town like Truckee or Dunsmuir, that the train would roll and he would get up. What were people thinking in these tiny towns, population 200, to see Roosevelt like this? Not just see him, but to converse with him, to shake his hand. It just, to me, it's such an epic trip. It's hard to even really fathom today.
Well, lucky them in that 200-person town. The ratio
Yeah.
is pretty good for a presidential encounter.
You go back through some of those towns today, it's like he was just there. There's a
Oh,
bandstand in South Dakota where the marker is on the bandstand. It's written with such excited language, it's like he was just there, you know. And
oh,
so you definitely can feel. There was a tree he planted up near in Campbell, California. The tree died. The city threw the stump into the city dump. A lady rescued it, replanted the
oh,
tree. That
oh
has
my
a plaque
gosh.
on it. I mean, you've got these moments out there that still exist where you can go sort of touch that trip a little bit.
Yeah, and that feeling of like, oh, he was just there. Like if you'd been a minute earlier, you might have
Right.
just seen him turning away. And I'm circling back to the sort of evocative idea of you wishing that you could walk through the petrified area with
Mhm.
Roosevelt. And you mentioned wanting to discuss the primordial landscape, but what else would you talk to TR about if you were sort of one on one in a nature environment like that?
The first thing, the non-nature question I would have for him, or what I would. I'm a big baseball fan, and he wasn't, and I would try and get him to a
Oh,
game.
no.
He's the only president in modern time who never went to a Major League Baseball game, I believe. And I would try and convince him to go with me, watch it through my eyes, and look for things that maybe would excite him. So that would be one part of it. But I think the prehistory to me to go through. I mentioned petrified forest because I love paleontology and Roosevelt's connection to earth science. I would love to get his take on that. So, in terms of other places with him, if I could have, as a journalist, I would love to have been a journalist on that train for the 9 weeks. To
Mm,
observe, to get him at moments where he's seeing things when he saw the Pacific Ocean for the first time, to capture that. When he sees his first redwood, his first sequoia, to capture that. That's what I would love, really, to walk through a forest grove with him and have
yeah.
him measure what he's feeling, what he's hearing, what he's feeling in that moment. To me, would have been really just he and I, just sort of to process and document his extemporaneous thoughts like that in nature.
Yeah. Let's carry on that sort of vibe here with a similar one. What do you think Roosevelt would have been like as a hiking companion, besides maybe talkative?
Well, talkative. They say very fast. He
Oh,
was all about pace, and you had to keep up. Very no
oh my
nonsense.
gosh.
And I think he would have been a wonderful. I like no nonsense hiking companions. One thing I don't like
Yeah.
with hiking is when you hear a lot of open conversations that have nothing to do with where you are. If people are talking about where you are, that's fine. But when you hear about people talking about like their stuff from home, and that to me is like there should almost be a sign at every trailhead. Talk about where either don't talk at all. I really like the silence. John Muir wrote an essay I read in college called "The Language of Water" about how
Oh,
listening to water in nature can teach you so much about where you are, what altitude, what kind of rock system, all these
oh,
things. In nature, I like silence. I really do, and I think Roosevelt. I want to guess would have been in the same mindset of immersion, of allowing
hmm,
yourself to just absorb what's around you, the sights, the smells, everything without too much chatter. But if there was chatter, it would be distinctly related to where you were and why you were there.
I love that, but I fear between not being able to talk about the nature, other things other than the nature around you, and keeping up a quick pace, I might not score an invite on your guys' hike, which is kind of a bummer for me because I'm a leisurely sort of stroller.
Even in Sharon Springs, there's a note in the book about he had gone hiking with people from Canada, and they were exhausted, but Roosevelt wasn't. And I think he had a way of exhausting people around him because the energy levels were just, I mean, really
Yeah,
just almost inexplicable, especially on this trip.
yeah, and I want to say it's Dalton or someone who mentions that there was only like one person who sort of outpaced Roosevelt when it came to the point to point sort of hikes, and I do not remember who
Hmm.
that was. If anybody remembers who that was, please drop it in the
I'd
chat.
like to know that
And
too.
and in the meantime, we'll turn it over to Richard here, who wants to know, did Roosevelt ever maybe come across Hiram Johnson, his 1912 running mate in this tour?
You know what? That's a great. Not to my knowledge, but it's certainly a note I'm going to take away, Richard. That's a good question. I mean, he met a lot of people, so I will. Again, people may not be aware. Roosevelt on this trip did not have a vice president. There was no contingency when McKinley was assassinated to have a VP in place. So Roosevelt's alone at this point. But no, that's a great question. I don't know, Richard, but I will. I'm going to take that to heart and go chase that down, and maybe we can all circle back here at the museum.
Yeah.
We should all meet. We should
Yes.
have a meet and greet at your place at some point, Marcy.
Chris, you're welcome anytime, and you know that. All right, another question here. Are there any descendants of Roosevelt active today in protecting the national parks or establishing new ones?
That's a good question. I wrote a long form about Theodore Roosevelt 10 years ago, and I got a call from Tweed Roosevelt, who you may probably know, the great-great-grandson. I don't know. He does wonderful work representing the family and the legacy. And he corrected me. He said, if you ever write anything else about TR, please refer to him as Theodore, because he didn't like Teddy, which was the title in my original piece. He said he preferred the formality of Theodore or TR. But that's a good question. I'm not really sure. But again, that's something that, I want to stress, this topic does not end for me with this book. It's questions like this, really good questions, that inspire sort of the next chapter, generational chapter of where I would go. And that's a really good question about, the conservationist mentality still being embraced by the family. So I will look into that. Thank you for that.
Yeah, I want to say that Theodore Roosevelt IV was profiled in the New York Times somewhat recently. So I love that those gentlemen are carrying on their family legacy there. We got a question here, tying it back to the national parks, sort of. Are there any points or values on which Roosevelt and Muir disagree?
Allegedly, there was one point of contention. If there was a point of conflict, it was the fact that Muir didn't believe in sport hunting. And by one of the accounts of Charles Leidig, he kind of read Roosevelt a minor riot act over the fire about not hunting for sport. Food is one thing. And that was something that was that I don't think Roosevelt was used to hearing, and may have initially kind of created a bit of a chilly moment, but that was what Muir believed. So that was the one point I think would have, based on the documentation by Charles Leidig, that would have been a point where they differed. Good question. And also, of course, later, without getting into the whole Hetchy thing, when Muir presented to Roosevelt, I don't know if you call that disagreement, but I don't think Muir was satisfied with Roosevelt's response to that years later.
Okay, I have a few questions here now. So you mentioned earlier in your talk that TR was getting a little bit stir crazy prior to this trip. And I know that TR's escapades, often westward, are associated sometimes with something dramatic going on in his life. Like he turns to nature for an escape. Was there any sort of thing like that that would have catalyzed his stir craziness to really want to get out there?
That's a great question. Maybe. I mean, it's hard to. I think when he had the accident in 1902, when he's laid up in the hospital after that terrible crash with the trolley car, I want to believe that might have instilled some sense of, just how temporary all of this can be and how in the blink of an eye. Now, look, he had been through raging battles. He knew that already. But in that moment, I mean, he came I don't think people realize, and the person next to him was killed in this accident. So I think that may have set up some sense of urgency. But I think in this instance, it was, to your point, yeah, there are these moments in his life where he needs to escape. I think at this point, the beauty of this moment is he really just looked at it as an opportunity. Here was this window that existed, that so rarely existed in his life. 2 months where you could do this. If you look at his presidency, it doesn't really happen again. And there are things that could have brought him back. There could have been some crisis, but there wasn't. And I think at this point, he really was just about getting out and seeing the country. I believe at that point, he had only gone as far west as Denver when he was campaigning for McKinley in 1900. So I really think at this point, it was about this just wonderful desire. And of course, to meet John Muir, to hang out with John Burroughs a bit, here he's going to be with these men who he reveres, he wants to learn from. He's a sponge for their experiences. So I think for him, it really was an expedition of sorts where he knew he was going to learn. He knew it was going to be, from a PR standpoint, it's brilliant. I mean, what better, you had both sides celebrating this trip because he was so boisterous and speaking artfully without he didn't politicize anything. There were no attacks. There was none of that. This was about celebration. This was about connection. So it really was a moment that I think in this instance for him, it was a learning expedition and a chance to really experience the country at a time where he knew there wouldn't be these kinds of opportunities.
Yeah, and I love how you pointed out that this was a trip that was sort of characterized by that joy and him at the front of the train wanting to pull the horn. Like, that's exactly
and
who
he's
you
riding
want.
horses into the wild.
Yeah.
Things we probably don't even know about. My hunch is he may have hunted a little bit on this. There were certain little telltale signs about a gun that may have been missing at this point, where he was doing what he did quietly. And what's interesting as well is if you read the official White House account of this trip, John Muir is not even mentioned. Burroughs is. And part of me, I thought about that. I thought, well, on one hand, maybe they didn't want to promote the fact that they didn't know where he was for a couple of days. But on the other hand, it didn't become bigger. Time has been very kind to that camping trip. It really, they didn't ride down from Glacier Point and say, well, we've created the national parks. It wasn't that. It happened over time. So I think it was inconsequential. The Burroughs trip was they could write about it, was a formal camping trip for almost 2 weeks. This was not that. This was this kind of quirky little escape from politics and all that it cast a shadow as time went by. You know what I mean? So I think that's more where it comes into view is the years afterwards rather than right when it happened. But they didn't even acknowledge it in the official record of the trip.
Wow. And now, Chris, we're going to turn it back to thinking about the descendants of TR by acknowledging that Tweed Roosevelt has joined us for our virtual program today. So hi, Tweed. Big fan of your work.
Oh my goodness, what an honor.
He would like to clarify that, yes, his cousins recently wrote a letter to the U.S. senators about the boundary dispute, which was extensively reported. TR4 has done a great deal about conservation, and we think, oh, Tweed said hi back. Wow,
oh, how wonderful.
Really kind of making my week, and it's only Monday.
Tweed Roosevelt, but again, he writing that, tuning into this, he is, no, wait a minute. I see the next comment. By the way, the badger was given to my grandfather, Archie. That was him in the picture. Oh, my God. Do you see that comment from Tweed? Oh, my goodness. Tweed Roosevelt, to me, is very important because, he's represented the legacy so beautifully and so accurately and so poignantly over the years. And not a lot of generational presidential families have a Tweed Roosevelt to do that. So I think we're all lucky. I know you're lucky at the museum to have. For him to chime in with that badger anecdote there, forget it. We should end right now because nothing's going to come close to that for me. Absolutely epic. Tweed, thank you. I have literal goosebumps right now.
Oh, Tweed. So not to steal Tweed's thunder, but I have to highlight our conversation that we had before this chat. Sure. This session sort of began. And I understand that you have met quite a number of interesting people in your lifetime, both literary and celebrity. So I have to go for the sort of lowball question here, Chris. Who is the most famous person you've met? And you can feel free to sort of hedge that by the most interesting famous person you've met, but I'll let you interpret and run with the question as you'd like.
That's interesting. I mean, I'll thank you for what you said. I mean, I've had a weird life in that I have found myself in lots of weird, random situations with people my whole life. I mean, it's just one of those things. But I think everyone, if you're paying attention, these things can happen. I was always very curious. And I had mentioned to you offline here about my experiences in the early 80s with like Andy Warhol and John Waters and these people when I was in college, which was super fascinating. I mean, Andy Warhol's really famous, but I don't think in terms of fame. One thing I learned early is that I don't react to celebrity. I don't care about that as much as I care what people do. You know, I had the distinct honor and privilege as a kid to be mentored by the fiction writer John Cheever, you know, till I was in college. You know, he was a neighbor of ours. I'd written him a note as a kid saying, I want to be a writer. Can you help me? And he did, for years, you know, for almost 10 years. So,
And Pulitzer Prize and National Book Award winning
oh yeah.
famous author,
Oh,
John Cheever. So that's just
but I never thought of
phenomenal.
him as a famous person. He was a great writer. But I will tell you, in high school, I'd been seeing him for a couple of years, and I was at the supermarket with my mom one day, and we're checking out, and on the cover of, this is 19, I think, 78, he was on the cover of Newsweek magazine, which back then was a really big deal, either Time or Newsweek. And it hit me that he was somebody. I didn't know or care. And I was going to his house that day, and so I bought the magazine. And we would go over things I'd written. It was by that point I knew him pretty well. And I went into his house and I dropped the magazine on the desk before him, and he's kind of looking at it. And there's this kind of weird, awkward pause. And I said to him, I said these exact words. I said, "You're John Cheever. Like, look at this, you know?" And he goes, he couldn't. And I said in that moment, I said, "Why do you let me in your house? I had no idea. I had no idea you were this, you know." And I didn't. And it was like what they would call today, I guess, imposter syndrome, you know. And he wanted to tell me a story that when he got my letter years earlier, he had been through a lot of hard things. He had just been allowed back in his house. He was a raging alcoholic. It was all in that article that I dropped on his desk. And he said, when I got your letter, he goes, that for me became part of my medicine.
Oh,
So from that point, we kind of, so, but to answer your question, I mean, I've interviewed so many interesting people. I get to sometimes books I've written with people. I don't take lightly that I've co-written memoirs of people that I have been a fan of. For instance, John Oates from Hall & Oates. I've always been a huge Hall & Oates fan. But getting to know John as I have and writing his book with him, because when you write a book with somebody, the trust levels are insane, and you learn things. You're hearing things they've never told anybody in their life. And it was John. I did a book with the Doobie Brothers and Dave Mason, all these people, and it's like those for me are really special. You know, those are meaningful to me. But so in terms, I mean, look, I've interviewed every major rock star, but I don't think of them as famous people. I think of them as great artists that it's a privilege to write about. You know what I mean? So again, it's hard for me to answer because I don't really think in terms of fame or celebrity versus accomplishment, you know. But that, I mean, okay, I again, this is like name dropping terrible, but I got to have this lunch once. This was one for me that I actually was like, oh my God. It was with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who, as a New York City basketball fan in the early 70s when he was coming up, he was from New York, went to Power Memorial High School. And so everybody knew about him as a high school player and then UCLA and whatnot. And I had an idea for a book idea with him, and it was arranged we could have lunch together. And it was the most incredible lunch because it was so personal and so interesting. And it was about baseball. It was about music. It was about jazz. It was just, I saw these sides of him that you just don't see normally, where he was like a little kid talking
oh,
about his youth and where he grew up and what the music he loved. Music, I always find, is a really great equalizer, and it just brings things out in people. It's because it's an emotional connection that we typically make with music. And so those are good conversations based on music, to me, can lead to great places. So I think
absolutely.
Kareem, if I had to pick one, that was just so special because to a kid who grows up a huge basketball fan in the 70s, to explain to him, you're sitting here with him now, discussing maybe a book thing is like, it's surreal, you know, and they're listening to you and asking you, well, how would you do this or that? And you have to keep it together. You can't act, you're dying inside, but you have to act sort of normal when you're doing it. You know what I mean?
Wow. Chris, I think this is going to be the first of many more
I
conversations.
sure
I
hope
love
so, Melissa.
chatting
You're
with
wonderful.
you.
You're a great conversationalist. What you've done with this program leading up to your opening this July. I mean, I watch all the time. I love that you've provided this platform, not just for me, but the other great writers you have on and guests. It's terrific. And I know I speak for everybody here. We cannot wait for July to come so we can get our bags packed and come visit and help celebrate this person that brings us all together today.
Oh, man. Are you looking for a job, Chris? Because I know a place that might want you over here, and it'll make our daily conversations a little bit easier in person. But hey, folks, if you liked this conversation, share it with a friend. Tune in like Chris. We hope it sparks a good conversation of your own. And as a last call here in the chat, make sure to fill out this form for a chance
Yes,
to win Chris's book. To hear more about
I have the
Josiah,
book right here. Get a copy
look at
of it. I
that.
hope you win.
I
I'm doing
hope
a
you
lot of book
win.
signing. In fact, I'm going to be at Yosemite to commemorate those dates, the camping dates, 15, 16, and 17. I'll be there this year doing talks and lectures each night in a variety of places, in those spaces, around campfires, on the Sugar Pine Railroad. I cannot wait to next month to be out there on those dates talking about what we're talking about. So if anyone's at Yosemite at that time, look it up and please join us.
All right, go join Chris in Yosemite, everybody. That sounds like a dream come true. And as a last sort of nod back to something very important that Chris highlighted here, tickets to the TR library are now on sale. So if you want to have a conversation with Chris and me in person, go to our library at trlibrary.com. You'll see a banner at the top for buying tickets. We look forward to meeting you out here, and we wish you all a wonderful night. Chris, thank you again so much. Everybody
Right
else,
back at you, Marcy.
take
Thank
care.
you.
We'll see you next time.